Okay, good afternoon, or possibly good morning or good evening, and welcome to today's virtual retro seminar. My name is Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Saïd Business School. I'm joined today by Rita Mota, who's the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Saïd Business School, who co-convenes these seminars with me, and by our speaker, Kendy Hess. Kendy is the Brake-Smith Associate Professor in Social Philosophy and Ethics at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's done very important work on corporate moral agency and on collective intentionality more generally. Rita and I are particularly excited to have her with us today because we've been working on both of those topics ourselves for some time, and we've been reading Kendy's work for at least 2 years. I'm going to turn the floor over to Kendy in a moment, but before I do so, I'll make a few quick remarks about the seminar. If you're a regular attendee, some of these remarks may seem vaguely familiar, but I think they bear repetition. Retro is Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford. It's an online seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. It's one of a wide range of seminars and conferences that occurs with the generous support of the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre directed by Rupert Younger here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford. Before it was an online seminar series, Retro used to happen in an Oxford seminar room. It became online when COVID-19 struck, and Rita and I have both been delighted to learn how well the online format can work. We've had incredibly exciting engagement throughout the online format, online series, and as an additional benefit, we get things that we wouldn't get from an in-person seminar. In particular, we've been able to involve a massive variety of people from all over the world. But it's been quite complicated to make all this happen. So I'd like to thank the people who've contributed to this effort. In particular, thank you to Rupert Younger, who's the director of the CCR, to Sarah Livingston, Chris Page, Mark Hughes Morgan, and Darius Juala. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Darius. I'm particularly grateful to Rita, whose energy, ideas, and expertise are the real driving forces behind these seminars. The Reputation Jawa, sorry, Darius. The Reputation Centre is concerned with social evaluations in general and with the social evaluations of corporations in particular. And in this context, an absolutely foundational question is whether a corporation, or indeed any organised collection of individuals, is the sort of thing that we can reasonably praise or blame. And if so, why? If we do blame a firm, are we excusing its members? Kendy's talk today is going to help us better to understand what's at stake here, and it will provide a possible route through the intellectual thicket. Because the seminar has quite a lot of people in it, we're going to be slightly formal about the Q&A process. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box and not into the chat, and either Rita or I will relay them to Kendy. She's going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, and after that, I hope that we can have a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. As usual, we're going to finish promptly at exactly 5 o'clock. So, Kendy, thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Alan and Rita, for inviting me today. I'm very excited about this. I'm going to try to share my screen. This worked earlier. Excellent. Yep, looks like it's working. There we go. Okay, and so as Alan had mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about avoiding the blame game. Some of the motivation for this talk came out of a conversation that I had with a friend a couple of years ago. I was complaining about something that was going on at my institution, something frustrating, and she asked me if I had chosen my voodoo doll yet. And I said, my what? And she said, you know, your voodoo doll, that one person who's just responsible for everything, so you can. And it was like my head exploded. I was like, have you read any of my articles? You can't do that. That's inappropriate. And she was mostly kidding, but a lot of people aren't mostly kidding. There's a really strong need and a strong motivation to find someone to blame when something has gone wrong. And I think I'm kind of missing this gene because I'm much more interested in preventing it from happening again. But the motive to blame plays significant social roles. It's part of how we express our commitments and how we shape behavior going forward. So it's important that if we are blaming, that we're doing it correctly. And I think it's especially difficult to do that in collective contexts, and especially difficult to do that in business settings. And so that's what led me to this talk. I guess I could have called it No Voodoo Dolls. But anyway, here's the plan. So first, we're going to talk about blame. So blame is really complicated. There's all these scholars who do nothing but figure out all the complexities of blame, and I'm just not going to do that today. So despite the fact that it's really complicated, I'm going to try to give a relatively simplistic statement that's basic enough to work for anybody. Given that, it's really complicated. But however complicated it is anyway, in any given situation, it's really complicated in a business setting. And that's not because business is for profit. People tend to get derailed about that, but that's not what makes it hard. So first we'll talk a little bit about blame, particularly in business settings. Then I'm going to outline 3 approaches to how to allocate blame in collective contexts, individualist, collectivist, and holist. My own preference, I'm going to focus on the holist approach to addressing blame. This is the approach that allows us to hold the firm itself as a blameworthy or blameable agent, blame-apt agent. But there are a number of concerns about that move, and so I'll consider 3 challenges to this holist approach of allocating blame, and then solve everything with the paradigm of collateral responsibility. The end. So that's how this is going to go. Okay. Blame in collective context, 5 sources of complexity. So anytime you're dealing with blame, it generally requires 5 things. First, you got to have a moral agent. If I'm walking through the trees and I get slapped in the face by a branch, can't blame the branch, right? You have to have a moral agent. You have to have an action of some kind. The moral agent must have acted in some way or failed to act. You got to have an obligation. There has to have been some moral obligation that applied to that agent doing that action. You got to have knowledge of some kind, and you got to have control. The agent had to have had knowledge and control about what was going on. So those are the 5 things required before you can blame anybody. So if you take a really simple event like Y getting slapped, X is to blame if, and only if, X is a moral agent, right? Not a branch, not a dog. There's an action, a specific action that X could have done. There's this action that would have significantly affected the event, made it less severe or prevented it from happening. An obligation of some kind. X had to have had an obligation to Phi. X had to have known about the obligation and the opportunity to act. And X had to have had control. X couldn't have been tied up in a closet somewhere, right? X had to be able to Phi in that situation. And if all 5 of those are met, then X can be blamed for Y getting slapped. So that's a quick outline of how blame functions, generally speaking. Now, all 5 of those elements are more complicated in a business context. So here's the 5 again. We're going to start with number 3. Regarding number 3, X, the moral agent, X's obligations are going to be more complicated in a business setting. So me just sitting here in my basement, I've got thousands and thousands of moral obligations right now, right? Just being a human moral agent, I've got all these obligations. And they don't just squeegee off when I go to work, right? You don't step through the doors of your business and suddenly become free from all of those moral obligations. You take those with you. So all of that stuff that you're usually carrying around still holds. What you have is added obligations on top of that come from professional obligations. You know, there are now standards that apply to my behavior that didn't apply when I was just sitting in my basement. There are role-based obligations about my position in the corporation. I have new relationships with different people that I wouldn't have had if I weren't sitting in this context. So all of the obligations become enormously more complicated and conflicting, and it's a mess. So that's one of the 5. Gone. Okay, 2, 4, and 5 the complexities here come from the collective nature of most business endeavor. And so some business endeavor is relatively simple. But for the most part, if we're looking at large organizations, 2, 4, and 5 are going to be much more complicated. So the actions in the business context tend to be big and complicated. Creating a new product or opening a new factory or polluting a river, right? It's this big, massive event, which is an action. The knowledge, on the other hand, tends to be sharply limited because each player knows only her part in this larger event that's occurring. And the control is sharply limited because each player controls only the little part that she herself plays. So each of these are different in a business context than that simple slapping thing. And so in this setting, the members are participating in actions where they lack knowledge, lack control, and don't necessarily identify with the end. They're contributing to ends that are not their own. And all of this is just typical of most organizational contexts. So all of those more complicated. However, Even though we're going to go back to the complexities about action, knowledge, and control, primary focus here is on number one, the moral agent, because the collective nature of most business contexts raises the possibility that the organization itself may be a moral agent. All right, so given all that complexity, what do we do about blame? Well, there's three basic approaches to allocating blame that track three basic metaphysical positions about what kinds of agents exist. And so the first one is the individualist position. And so according to individualists, only individuals intend, act, and thus bear blame, right? So things like groups, mobs, teams, those are really kind of a fiction. It's a linguistic shorthand for referring to that group of individuals, right? So you got these 5 individuals and they're each thinking X, right? That's what the little X is. It's an intentional state, belief, desire that they have in their heads. A lot of people want to say that there's another thing there. There's those 5 people and there's a group or a team or something. But the individualists say no, there isn't. There's only the 5 individuals. In that case, the only accessible actions are the actions of the individuals, because that's all there is to act. And so each member there is going to be a moral agent who acted in some way. Each moral agent can only be blamed for her own instance of fying. Okay, so regarding storming the Bastille, which for some reason completely unknown to me is really popular example in the collective literature. Okay, Bastille got stormed. Each member who participated in storming the Bastille was a moral agent, presumably, who did something. Now, the fying here on an individualist account involves throwing stones and yelling things and punching people and breaking down gates, right? The fying cannot be storming the Bastille because no individual did it. Storming the Bastille is not something that an individual can do. It's like playing a symphony. You can't, right? So in that case, questions of blame, of obligation, knowledge, and control are going to relate only to each agent with respect to her own instance of fying in its own right. So if there's to be blame for the storming of the Bastille, it's for throwing stones, yelling things, punching people, not for the larger event of storming the Bastille. That's how that's going to work. So in a business context, if you have a business activity like creating a new product, opening a new factory, polluting a river, again, each member is going to be a moral agent who fyed. The fying here, if we go with creating a new product, is going to be brainstorming ideas. Ooh, I engineered the design. I conducted marketing surveys. I negotiated with suppliers, right? Those are the phys, the activities that are going to be involved. The fying can't be creating a new product because no individual did that. And so questions of blame, obligation, knowledge, and control are going to relate only to each agent and her own instance of fying in its own right. So if there's blame, it's for brainstorming ideas, negotiating with suppliers, and the rest of that, not for the larger event. The difficulty is that those individual actions taken in isolation are unlikely to violate a moral obligation. And so the likely result is that no one is to blame for anything. Individualism. All right, that's not very satisfying. Now that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's not very satisfying. So we set that aside, move on to the next possibility. According to collectivists, a properly unified collective does exist. It's a new thing, and it can intend and act, although the blame is still going to distribute to the members. So one popular proponent of collectivism is Seamus Miller. And so for him, a properly unified collective is one where the members are unified by shared internal states, what he calls collective ends. And so for him, that's an end that's possessed by each of the individuals involved. And it's actually quite a demanding standard. And so each agent has to have this state of affairs as their own independent end, and they have to aim at it under more or less the same description each way. So if we go back again to our image, we've got the 5 people, they've got those X's in their head, right? They all have the same end. And because they have that shared collective end, they're unified into a new thing, right? Margaret Gilbert is another proponent. She has a slightly different account, but it's still the same basic structure of members unified by a shared internal state. She calls them joint commitments. So for her approach, X and Y are jointly committed to phi when they each independently commit themselves to phi with the other, conditional, reciprocal agreement. And so again, it's quite a high standard in each case. All right, but that does get you a collective that can do things. Whoa. Okay, so with regard to storming the Bastille, once again, each member is a moral agent who fyed. The fying here involved adopting a collective end or entering into a joint commitment, which was to storm the Bastille. That's the X that's in everybody's head. The resulting collective, the larger circle, acted by storming the Bastille. Each member had the end or intention, and thus the collective did as well. It's that same set of X's applying across all the levels. Each member knew she had this end and acted to further it through the collective. Each member could have done otherwise. Therefore, if storming the Bastille violated a moral obligation, the collective did it, and each member is to blame. So that's how blame is going to work on a collectivist account. So that sounds more satisfying, which again, isn't the same as right, but that seems to be getting at our intuitive sense of what's going on here. The difficulty is that most contemporary business contexts, that unity requirement isn't going to be met. So let's look at that again. So for example, the 1.3 million members of Amazon are not unified or motivated in their daily work by the shared personal goal of promoting online shopping. The drivers, the secretaries, the accountants, the marketing, the managers, the tax guys, all of those people didn't wake up and say, oh, there needs to be online shopping, and get together with all those other 1.3 million people to bring about online shopping. That's not how it functions. Now that's an empirical claim. I could be wrong about that, but unless that's what happened, they're not going to meet the requirement, at least for Miller. Similarly, the 70,000 members of BP have not entered into conditional reciprocal agreements, each with each other, about anything, much less about producing petroleum. And so these unifying requirements typically aren't going to be met in most of the larger businesses that we're interested in here. So because those X's aren't present, you don't have a qualifying collective. They don't form a properly unified collective, and that means we're just individuals and we're right back where we started again. So that's the individualist and the collectivist approach to blame in collective corporate business settings. That leaves the holists. This is the third account. So according to the holist, a properly unified collective is what's called a corporate agent or a group agent. There's other language around it. Now, a corporate agent is a metaphysically unified individual. So it is an individual that is able to perform the large actions we're interested in and competent to bear moral responsibility and blame, right? So you got your setting there. The corporate unity does not require shared intentions or intentional states. Those X's in the head go away, but the whole stays. With that, the corporate agents avoid the difficulties that leave both the collectivists and the individualists unable to assign blame. So that's the holist claim. So a little bit about how that works. Okay, corporate agents. This is my account. There are other accounts, but they're all similar along the dimensions that are going to matter here. Excuse me. So a corporate agent, a properly unified collective, is one in which the members are unified into a single whole, not by those X's in their head, but by the structure. So the structure is external to the members, but internal to the corporate agent itself. And so here's an image of it. So you got 6 people here, and you got that black wavy line. That's my representation of the structure. And for whatever reason, no X's, each of these individuals have chosen to commit themselves to the structure, to join the structure, you could say to subordinate themselves to the imperatives of the structure. They each have their own reasons, they're all different, doesn't matter what they are, as long as they have made that decision and effectuated it, that is going to create a corporate agent. That's what it takes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what that structure is. Okay, structure, this is drawing on Sally Haslinger's work, if anybody's familiar with that. Structure is a network of social relationships which impose constraints on member action. So these constraints include incentives and direct demands. Some of them are documented, some are just bound up in pure expectation, right? That kind of sideways look when somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to, incredibly effective way to manage behavior. Now, none of these are coercive, right? Nobody's rational autonomy is being overridden. Everybody has their free will and their own commitments, their own thoughts, but they're still very effective at shaping behavior. So these structures organize the thought, communication, and actions of the members. So it's a relatively deep integration. When we're participating in one of these structures, when we're at work, we think about different things than when we don't, than when we're not. We communicate with different people in different ways. We behave differently. And that's the claim here. So the structure is what captures that. And it provides templates of interaction. We know how to behave at work. We know how to treat people that will favor certain forms of action and coordination. It'll make certain kinds of things available, concepts, resources, social relationships, power. And Haslanger's got this great line where she says, it structures the possibility space for their agency. That's structure. Now, 4 things about that structure are going to matter here. The first one is that the structure is not neutral. It's not just lining people up in alphabetical order. It's aimed at achieving very specific goals in very specific ways. It's got these people bound together for a reason, right? Another way of saying exactly the same thing is that that structure embodies commitments about fact and value. It makes assumptions about how the world is and what matters that shape the kinds of behaviors that it encourages, the possibility space that it creates. Secondly, that structure is immensely complex. It's not just an org chart and a bunch of policies that somebody wrote up and never paid any attention to. These are official and unofficial policies and practices, explicit and tacit expectations. It includes culture, but it isn't limited to the culture. It's multiply interpretable, culmination of the actions and decisions of hundreds, thousands of people over the entire course of the organization's existence. This isn't just something that got cranked out of the executive suite, right? This is a lived reality. As a result, it evolves over time. The elements can be intentionally, officially amended by executive action, or unofficially, and they can evolve or arise in the absence of intentional action, just through drift or changes in practice. And finally, this structure forms the core identity of the corporate agent and grounds its distinct intentionality. So that's a holist corporate agent. What does that look like? Okay. So if you got a corporate agent, you got a group of people made out of people, Soylent Green, organized in some way, right? In this case, they're organized by the structure. Now, they still have all of their own individual beliefs, desires, intentions, commitments, right? And so those may be to not X, not Y, and Z, right? They're thinking all those things. However, they're participating in a structure which itself embodies commitments about fact and value. So the structure itself can be committed to X, Y, and not Z, even if the members hold contrary commitments. And people seem to find this kind of weird, but it's entirely familiar. We've all been members of organizations where we complied with policies that we didn't agree with, or that we didn't even understand, that we didn't even know we were embodying and implementing. And so that's all this is really reflecting. And the point about corporate agency is that in this case, where you have a group of people committed to not X and not Y and Z, and a structure committed to X, Y, and not Z, when you have that kind of conflict, when the members act collectively as members from their position in the structure, the collective result is going to reflect the commitments of the structure and not the commitments of the members. So that's how corporate agents act. Entities like that can generate their own intentional states, another fancy way of saying beliefs and desires, generate beliefs and desires with moral content. That X and that Y could be respect rights, or act generously, right? They can integrate those states into what's called a rational point of view, an RPV, to make sure that those commitments are more or less consistent with each other so that it's capable of acting on them without just kind of shorting out. And specifically, it can act on the basis of those commitments of that RPV. So with all of that, moral responsibility. All right, back to blame. You need 5 things in order to blame something. Say that the event is a new product, new factory, or a polluted river, right? Some big businessy kind of thing to do. X, Amazon, BP, my favorite Acme, is going to be to blame for that new product, that new factory, polluting the river, or is going to be praised if it's something good. You have to remember sometimes something good happens. If it's a moral agent, which I've just sketched the argument for the fact that it is. It is in fact a moral agent. If it is a moral agent, then the action. Could X have significantly affected the issuance of the new product, the opening of the new factory? Well, hell yeah. You know, Amazon didn't have to issue that new product. It could have not issued the new product. No individual member of Amazon necessarily could have stopped it, but Amazon could have. Has to be an obligation to act in that way. Has to be knowledge. Amazon knew it was issuing whatever that wrist thing is that checks your mood and reports it to your employer. And there has to be control. Amazon has to have been able to act in the way in order to fulfill the obligation. And so it's always going to be a matter of empirical data about whether each of these requirements was actually met in any given instance. But my only claim here is that it's entirely plausible that they would be. And so in that case, the firm itself becomes the entity that can be blamed, that can be held responsible or praised for things that have happened, for those big events that the collectivists and the individualists can't reach. Now, there are some concerns about that move. Scapegoating the members. There's two different versions of this concern. So the first one is that when we blame the corporate agent, the firm, we blame the members for too much. So the first version of this is a conceptual claim. This isn't really a very good argument. So it starts with the idea that Acme is identical to its members, right? You know, there's Amazon, there is no such thing as Amazon. There's really just those 1.3 million people, right? It's a shorthand. So it's identical. Whatever happens to Acme, therefore, happens to the members. That's going to follow logically. Therefore, in blaming Acme for fying, we are blaming the members for fying. No member fyed, as we just talked about at length. So in blaming Acme, we blame individual members for things they didn't do. So that's the first argument. Both P1 and P2 are simply false. P1 is false. Insert long, dry discussion about metaphysics, which I'm happy to get into if people want to do later. And 2 is false. Whatever happens to Acme happens to its members is just not true. Acme can be held criminally liable for something without any of its members being held criminally liable for something. Acme can go bankrupt without any of its members going bankrupt. Acme can enter a merger without any of its members merging anything. Okay, so P2 is just false. It's not a very good argument. Okay, scapegoating the members 2. Blame the corporate agent, the firm, we blame the members for too much as a causal claim. This one's more interesting. Premise 1, Acme is closely related to its members. Okay, dodge that bullet. Whatever affects Acme affects its members. Better. In blaming Acme, we impose negative effects on it. We are entitled to impose these negative effects on Acme because it fyed. In blaming Acme, we impose negative effects on the members. Causal chain, not identity. The members did not fy. Discussed that at length. Therefore, we are blaming the members for things they didn't do. That's better. But the conclusion doesn't actually follow, okay? So premises 1 through 6 are all fair enough, like we could tweak those around. But the difference is the move to blaming in the last premise. So this relies on an unjustified equivalency between blame and negative effects, right? So if we're blaming Acme, if we're blaming Amazon, if we're blaming BP, we're imposing negative effects on Amazon or BP. Again, criminal liability is a great example, although we're only talking about moral responsibility. Presumably something bad happens when we blame. There are costs, and those are being imposed on Acme. If there's a huge boycott, right, because everybody's pissed at Acme, then there are going to be negative effects for Acme, and many of those are going to cause negative effects for the members. Right? So that much is true, but that doesn't mean that the members are being blamed. It just means that there are negative consequences when somebody gets punished. And there are always negative effects for other people when somebody gets blamed or punished. If I get in trouble, believe me, my husband will be miserable. Right? Or if somebody does something bad and we send them to prison, all of their friends and family suffer. So it's unfortunate, but not distinctive in this case, that when one agent gets blamed, other agents can suffer consequences as a result of it. So that one also is not a particularly strong argument against this particular instance of assigning blame to the firm. Last one's the most interesting. And so the concern here is that when we blame the corporate agent, we blame the members for too little. So here's this one. Acme is separate from its members. If Acme is the agent which fyed, then necessarily no member is the agent which fyed. Just made that argument, right? Blame is distributed. Blame is allocated to one agent, cannot be allocated to another one, right? So if you broke the vase, and I blame you for breaking the vase, then I can't blame anybody else because you've used up all of the blame that there was to go with that. Therefore, if Acme is to blame for fying, then necessarily no member is to blame for fying. All right, this one's better. Premise 1 is a little misleading. Insert long, boring, dry discourse about metaphysics that I'm happy to talk about if people want to. But P3 is the one that's false here. it is true that most of the collective literature has assumed a distributive approach to blame, but that is not the only available paradigm here. So that is the most popular one, and here's how that works. I already talked about it with the vase, but you've got your agent here, right? It's got all these different members, and so if it gets blamed for something, right? If it gets blamed for polluting the river or for creating some new product that leads Amazon to world domination, the blame goes to the entity and then gets parceled out to the members, and there's nothing left over, right? A lot of the discussions about this have been whether there's any blame left over to stick to the corporate agent or to distribute to the members. You know, how do we divvy up this fixed pie of blame, and how does it get distributed? So that's one way to approach it. There's problems with that approach generally. It just seems like a weird way to talk about blame. But what I'm going to suggest is that there's a different paradigm that we're all familiar with that can apply here. And so I'm calling this collateral responsibility because you got to name it something. And so think of any situation in which one agent is responsible for shaping the free actions of another. And I'm suggesting here role models that get in trouble when they do things that encourages the kids to go do bad things, or advisors who give bad advice, parents who raise children who are behaving badly. In each case, we tend to assign blame to the role model, the advisor, or the parent. And so I want to look at what we're doing there, why that makes sense to do that. So we got Alan standing here, and he's thinking, not why, don't pollute the river, or whatever, right? And Barb comes along, and she's got some really interesting arguments about why. I should probably have used X here. And so over time, they have conversations, and she just convinces Alan. She's got good reasons. And so Alan changes his mind. He says, he adopts the commitment Y, and off he goes. And off he goes to Y, to pollute the river, or whatever he does, right? So in this situation, I'm saying, we're familiar with this. Alan is acting autonomously from his own RPV. She didn't brainwash him or anything, right? And so Alan is fully responsible for his own actions in polluting the river, or whatever he did. However, Barb is also acting autonomously from her own RPV. And so she's fully responsible for her own actions in influencing Alan. And that makes her collaterally responsible for Alan's actions. And this is the extra piece. So the idea here is that there isn't one amount of blame for Alan's Ying, right? That there's blame for Ying, and then an additional different kind of responsibility for her actions in convincing him to do that. It's additive. It doesn't get distributed or shared out. And so I'm saying that the relationship between members and the corporate agent is analogous in this case. So you've got Acme standing there with a commitment to not Y. Don't pollute, don't pollute, don't pollute. Or let's make it something nice. Don't protect the environment. Don't protect the environment. And then Barb, one of the members, comes along, and she gives some arguments, right? And she says, no, we should take care of the environment. And there's a lot of different ways she can do this. She can address the executives. She can go address the board. She can talk to her fellow manager people about the kinds of ways they ought to behave. She can impose policies on people who are lower down, right? There are a lot of ways that she can address the structure. She can address the existing commitments and argue that the existing commitments ought to be changed. She can't just change them, but she can give arguments. And if she's effective, Acme will change its position. It will adopt a different value. And as a result, it will go act differently. Now, in this case, once again, Acme is acting autonomously from its own RPV. It hasn't been overridden or supplanted by anyone else's, and it is thus fully responsible for its own actions. But member Barb is also acting autonomously from her own RPV. She is fully responsible for her own actions, for better or worse, and collaterally responsible for Acme's. So this is how the paradigm of what I'm calling collateral responsibility, which I'm saying is familiar from other settings, would be applied in this case. And this would allow us to hold the members liable for their own actions in affecting Acme's commitments, and then Acme remaining responsible for its own behaviors. And so just two quick things about this. That in corporate settings, this collateral responsibility will be sensitive to the situatedness of different members in a way that those distributive accounts aren't. Distribution tends to follow from membership rather than actual behavior. And so it doesn't tend to differentiate. Everybody's equally members. But here, the contribution to shaping the corporate RPV is going to vary. So executives will have more influence over a broader range of commitment. So appropriately, they're going to end up having more collateral responsibility for Acme's behavior. But lower level members will still have some. they'll still have more influence over broader commitments than is often acknowledged. They'll have particular influence over ACME's beliefs about how the world is because they're the ones who collect and report that data up. And so if they choose to attend to certain events like racial impact recently, that will get incorporated into ACME's RPV. And if they don't, it won't. And so this leaves room for every member of the organization from top to bottom to have some collateral responsibility while remaining sensitive to the very different amounts of control and power that they have. So in the case of the polluting ACME, ACME might develop a new commitment to doing what's right. That's probably going to come at the executive level. ACME might develop a belief that current practices are causing problems, bad publicity, declining sales. That's probably lower level. But in either case, it can lead to a change in ACME's commitments and therefore a change in ACME's behavior. In the case of the new product, new factory, the merger, I leave it to your imagination or future empirical research. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kendy. That was fantastic.
Oh, I went long. I'm sorry.
No, it was perfect length and had an enormous amount of material in it. So there are some questions appearing in the Q&A. If you have questions, please type them in and we will read them out. I'm going to abuse my position and just ask you a kind of clarifying question. And I suspect I can guess what you're going to say, but I would like better to understand what it means for a corporate agent to know something. And I suspect, and how that relates to the notion of collateral responsibility. So I suspect your answer's got something to do with the formation of intentional states like believe, but that's not the same as know, right? And you said you have to know. And I'm just wondering whether, I mean, clearly if the organization knows something in some sense that I don't understand, it knows something because of the actions of the people it has. What's the difference between individual, I mean, this is possibly a question that takes us too far from what you're thinking about, but what's the relationship between the knowledge of individuals and the knowledge of the corporation, and can we assign collateral responsibility for the way that one turns into the other?
Interesting. Okay, I'm rather desperately remembering my epistemology class from grad school, and I know there's justified true belief, and I know Gettier ruined that for everybody. So to the extent that knowledge is different than belief, I think I could probably make everything go through just with belief. I'd have to go back and work that through.
Seems obvious to me how you could make belief work because that's part of your rational point of view, right? But you explicitly the organization knows stuff, and
yeah, I think
often clear to me what that means.
Yeah, the first difference I would go to would be the JTB, the justified true belief. So it's knowledge if it's justified and it's true. And so the justifications will usually turn, again, this is like 15 years ago, the justifications will usually turn on process, that the information came from a reliable source by a reliable process. And so to the extent that the corporation has good mechanisms in place such that its beliefs, the beliefs that are generated through that internal process are generally true, that it's a reliable process from reliable sources, then I think it's generally going to count as knowledge.
So this is an extra requirement on structure, right? The structure could generate all sorts of stupid beliefs, which would be part of a rational point of view.
Yeah.
You have an additional requirement that the corporate governance mechanisms of the corporation generate reasonable beliefs too.
Needs to be reasonable. And again, I think one of the reasons that doesn't often come up as a constraint is because there's so much practical pressure in place to make sure that that happens. You know, any corporate agent that can't form reliable beliefs or can't act on them reliably is just going to fall apart. You know, it's going to dissolve into its individual members, and at most you'd have a collective or a cooperative of some kind. If you don't have a reliable mechanism, it's going to get kind of Darwinistically removed from the process. So I think that's what goes in with knowledge.
Possibly, we could talk about the continued survival of political parties that have ridiculous.
I'm not sure those are going to count as, well, anyway.
Well, they're corporate bodies, right? They have members, they have a point of view that is possibly internally consistent.
So this is the thing, like I get into this with people all the time about nation states. I don't think nation states are corporate agents.
No, I don't, but I think
I think governments probably
the Conservative Party or the Labour Party in England or the Democratic Party.
But yeah, I'm not sure they're disciplined enough I think they're sort of like a government. I think they have a central body that qualifies as a corporate agent,
Okay.
but so many of their members aren't.
So could I think of the Democratic
engaged.
caucus as being a corporate body?
Yeah, that makes me feel better.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I have a Democratic and a Republican caucus with completely opposing worldviews. Only one of them can be a moral agent by your account, because one of them must be wrong.
yeah, well, they could both be wrong. Well, and you
Okay.
can still be wrong. Like the simple fact that you're mistaken about something doesn't make you not an agent or not a moral agent.
I feel comfortable blaming either of them, even if they have. Okay, this is fun, but there are too many questions we need to pursue it. Rita, do you want to go?
Yes, like Alan, I also had some questions, but we're getting so many in the chat that I think I better jump right into it. Otherwise, we won't have time to cover any of it. So I'll go straight to Grant Roseboom's question, which is really interesting. So Grant says, thank you so much for the helpful presentation and for motivating the holistic view, the holist view. And he says he's very amenable to the view, but he's wondering about whether more than just unified corporate social structure is needed for moral agency. So he talks about the fact that young children, great apes, could have agency, knowledge, intention, etc., but they don't really seem to be fully blameworthy. And so he asks if the moral and moral agency points to something in addition to that, that these agents lack, and that possibly social structures lack too. Which could be especially important when we think about praiseworthiness, which would require the right kinds of motives, like goodwill. And so he's wondering, what do you think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a step from agency to moral agency that I would use exactly the examples that you've used there, right? Like the great apes or young children, or right, there are things that are clearly, well, I would say, clearly agential and quite sophisticated agents that don't necessarily rise to the level of moral agents, although there's some really interesting research on chimps and bonobos about, and actually on gorillas about moral agency there, but we could talk about that later. So yeah, there's a different step. Frank Hendricks has written about this. He calls it normative competence, which I think is a good phrase to capture what needs to be there. I talk about this a little bit in one of my articles called about Kantian, ghost. Does the machine need a ghost? Would be a place where you could see a more extensive place where I tried to work this out. So in answer to your question, yes, there's something beyond agency that's required for moral agency. I've picked up from Frank, I've called it normative competence. And the way I've cashed that out is that you have to be able to recognize morally relevant information. And I've tried to keep that as broad as possible so that I can get the utilitarians and the Kantians and the virtue ethicists and the natural law people, you know, they all recognize some kind of morally relevant information. They just disagree on what it is. And so to be a moral agent, you have to be capable of recognizing that as salient, as, you know, that it matters that this is pain and this is pleasure, or it matters that this is disrespectful and this isn't. You have to be capable of recognizing it and acting appropriately in response, you know, to recognize that that is a rights violation, and therefore I am not going to do that. And so if you have something that is capable of making that recognition and acting on it, I would say that you have a moral agent. And then I have a whole story about how corporations, firms, don't have to be incorporated, can do that kind of thing. And it absolutely draws on the abilities of their members, but the members are a constitutive part of the thing, right? So they're not separate from it. That's not outsourcing the work. Everything it does comes up through the members. But ACME can be aware that it is doing a moral violation of some kind, even if none of the members individually are aware of that. It can be collectively available within the organization, and it can be shaping ACME's behavior, even if the individuals within it are only acting piecemeal. So yes, normative competence, yes, requires, I think, awareness and the ability to act, and I think they can do it. And when they do it, it's different than the members doing it for themselves.
So just to follow up, do you think that it's possible that a structure could prevent individual members from exercising their own normative competence in a way that contributes to the normative competence of the group agent?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
I think that you could easily have, and I almost want to say that that's more common than not. That seems unduly bitter for so early in the morning. But yeah, you know, one of the ideas, Ed Freeman has this great article called the Business Sucks Story, which all of you should read. It's 6 pages. It's really short. It's gorgeous. We have this weird narrative. Well, we don't. That's why we're here. But there's this weird narrative in the world that business is this amoral, evil place. Like, you can read hundreds of years of history where people think that the rise of the market is great because we can get out all of our aggressions there and we don't have to go to war. And so we've bought into this narrative where moral concerns don't have a place at the office. You're supposed to leave them at home and come in and pull your lever all day long, whatever it is, and go home. And so we have an entire cultural narrative, much less what's happening in any individual company, that asks people to suppress those kinds of concerns. We're recently seeing something of a release of that, at least here in the States, around the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the accountability around that. But the release has almost been more problematic than the previous repression, because we don't have structures in place that make that productive, that allow us to incorporate those concerns instead of just blowing up the machine. So, sorry, that's a really long answer, but yes, the short answer to that would be yes. It's a big problem.
Thank you. Alan?
Okay, we have so many questions. I'm just going to randomly select one. Alan Giles is asking a question that is slightly apart from what you're talking about, but he wonders whether he's pointing to the distinction between moral responsibility and legal liability. And he says that there's a trend in the UK, at least, that enforcement agencies are increasingly targeting senior executives rather than corporations. And he wonders if there is a structural explanation for that. Is it that, senior executives are so responsible for creating the point of view, the rational point of view of the corporation, that the senior executives should be held more responsible? Or is this just something political? And a closely related question comes from Rupert Younger, who asks how you decide how the split of blame goes between the person who makes the action and the influencer.
Yeah, that's a big part of how I got into this topic in the first place. Is there's this immediate move to blame the CEO, right, or the executive suite, or the C-suite. People are getting a little more expansive, but there's just this instantaneous move. And I think I said at the beginning, I think I'm just missing a gene here. I really don't get a buzz out of blaming people, so I personally just skip that step. But my concern about it is the problem. One of the practical problems with just blaming the executives is that suggests that they're the problem. And so if you could just pull out that bad apple, right? Just pull out that executive, pop in somebody new, you can fix the problem. But the new person just steps directly into the same organization with exactly the same structure. And so having the new person there just gets you somebody who doesn't even know how the structure works, isn't even familiar with this organization. So instead of fixing the problem, there's a good chance you've just made it work, because the first thing they're going to have to do is learn how the organization works before they can start changing it. Whereas the person who would have been there before at least could have made more effective use of that existing knowledge to make the changes to the structure that would have changed the corporate behavior. Now, in terms of blame, executives typically are going to have more knowledge and more control and more influence over the RPV, over the commitments of the organization. So if we're dishing out blame, they should, in most cases, have more, although that's always going to be an empirical matter. It's never going to be a conceptual claim about rank or anything like that. It's always going to be based on the facts. But I think it's a distraction. And I think we're so bound up in finding somebody to blame that we're missing out on some valuable opportunities to fix things. But I don't think they should be off the hook. I mean, if they just sat there and let their corporation run rampant over people, well, if they let it happen and they didn't do anything about it, well, then they should be blamed for that. That's inappropriate.
Sometimes it's more than, I guess, the question that's implicit in what Rupert and Alan are both asking is, sometimes it's more than sitting there and letting it happen, right? So it's very hard to argue that one or two people at Enron weren't directly responsible for the culture, that for the rational point of view that allowed what happened to occur.
And in that case, hang them. Well, no, I mean, don't. Sorry, but yeah, and in those cases where there really is such a dominant personality, well, then they do become sort of coextensive with the RPV. The corporation starts to be an extension of their RPV. instead of being its own independent place. And then they should have all the responsibility that goes with that.
The trend towards holding the chief executive accountable can only be rationalized in your account if the chief executive is creating the RBV more than previously was the case.
A lot, yeah. And one interesting thing is all the research on executive compensation that shows that they have very little control over what's actually happening within the corporation. That we have a highly inflated idea of what they're actually contributing at the highest levels. And so that would also be relevant to this. That research would also be relevant to this question.
Okay, Rita.
So there's a question here that I find interesting. You might not have time to go into a lot of detail about it, but Philippe Mosqueta is asking about the relationship between your view on collateral responsibility and whistleblowing. So people who are faced with this situation of where they might feel like they have to blow the whistle might face a moral dilemma. They might think that they have conflicting moral obligations. How do you see the articulation between the account of the allocation of responsibility that you just gave us and the sort of dilemmas that people experience in that position?
I think in that case, it's really complicated, because one thing that my account does is you not only have your obligations, your social bonds with your coworkers, which hopefully you have, hopefully your workplace is healthy enough that there's some sort of collegiality there. And so you're not only concerned about that, but you can arguably have obligations of loyalty to this entity that is the firm. And I think it's important that we recognize that people aren't delusional when they do that firms are the kind of thing that you can have that kind of relationship to. And so the whistleblower is in a difficult practical situation, because there are practical implications, and a very difficult moral situation. I think where I would go with that would be sort of an Aristotelian conception of friendship, that part of what you owe, in addition to loyalty to the people that you have relationships to, is to help them do right. And it's, in all of the examples I gave with parents, advisors, role models, part of what's implicit in recognizing those relationships as significant is recognizing not just the ability to influence people, but a kind of an obligation that if you're going to influence another agent, it ought to be for the better, for the good. And that can be unpleasant sometimes. Sometimes it involves whistleblowing and calling people out. And so I would guess that morally speaking, there'd be some preference for internal dealing, for sitting down with your friend and talking about it, or reporting things internally first. And if it doesn't work, then you have an obligation both to the person, to the entity, to the firm, as well as to yourself to make the report.
Can I just follow that very quickly? So if this person concluded that this obligation to do something about the situation, so, tried to deal with it internally, didn't work. So only real option is to blow the whistle, but then they don't for some reason. And the corporation goes, or the firm goes and does exactly the thing that this person didn't want to happen. Does the potential whistleblower who did not blow the whistle attract more responsibility and more blame because they did not blow the whistle?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because they had they noticed something, and it's admirable that they noticed and they realized that it was a problem. But then, with great responsibility comes great power. Once you noticed it, they had an obligation to do something about it, and they didn't. And so they would bear more for that.
So I guess the problem is when you think that whistleblowers often suffer such serious repercussions when they do blow the whistle, you put people in an impossible position where they either blow the whistle and suffer those repercussions, or they don't blow the whistle and they attract a higher level of moral responsibility for whatever the corporate agent does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure it's a tragedy. I'm not sure it's an actual dilemma, but yeah, I mean, that's why it's such a horrible position to be in. And, if we're actually, again, if we're thinking about blame as an amount, right? Like the amount that gets applied to somebody gets diminished by the choices they were making, right? If they were confronted with losing their job, then it's certainly understandable. That doesn't make it not wrong. It just makes it not blameworthy, perhaps, would be a different way of getting at that.
Great. Thanks. Ellen?
Okay, so let's see if you can answer this one in 4 minutes, Kendy. Kevin McSweeney is asking a question that I suspect I know what you're going to say too, but it's an interesting one. So I think what he's basically doing is defending the position that List and Petit promulgate in their book, where they say that the corporation's intentional states supervene upon the intentional states of the individual members. Now, in their case, that doesn't prevent them from ascribing moral responsibility, because the way that supervention occurs is complicated. But Kevin basically says, look, any structure is the function of the members. If you move the members around, the beliefs they have, the way they interact will change. So why do we need to blame the corporate moral agent? He's asking really how you justify your claim that the corporate agent is more than its members. Why doesn't its RPV supervene entirely on the members?
Oh boy, metaphysics. Okay, so it does supervene. So supervenience is kind of an empty catch-all metaphysical phrase, right? It's a way of capturing a number of different relationships between a higher level phenomenon and a lower level phenomenon. And so you use supervenience when you just don't want to get into it, basically. But the one thing that holds for all claims of supervenience is that you can have changes in the bottom without changes in the top. You can't have a change in the top without a change in the bottom. But things happen all the time down here without changing this. And that's why the supervenient relationship is so important, that the RPV remains constant across all kinds of changes in the behavior of the members, the beliefs of the members, the identity of the members, all that stuff constantly frothing around while this stays steady, like a duck, right? Calm on the surface, crazy underneath, right? And so the reason you need that is you need the RPV to be sustained over changes. You can't have the responsibility of the corporation, the identity of the corporation constantly flipping around without having this steady on the top. So I would agree that there's a supervenience relationship, but that's what makes it possible to blame the organization. That doesn't undermine the possibility of blame. That's what makes it possible. If we lose that, then we fall back on individualism or collectivism and nobody's responsible, which may be your preferred outcome. You can buy the bullet and say, yeah, nobody's responsible for what Amazon does. But that has its own costs. I'm tempted to get into it, but we're running awfully low on time. Rita, do you have a question that could be answered in a minute?
I don't think so. This all requires really much more than 1 minute. It's super interesting, but I think we need to
draw things to a close. So, Rita, would you like to advertise our next seminar before I stop?
Well, just really quickly, if anybody had a question that you actually wanted to hear the answer to, please feel free to email me. That last slide had my email address on it, or I could put it in the chat or something.
And there's always Google.
So yeah, you can just Google me. There aren't that many.
We will also make sure that you get a copy of every single question that's been typed.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
You'll see everything. The next seminar, Rita, is?
The next seminar is in a couple of weeks. We're really lucky because we're going to have, and I hope I don't completely mispronounce his name, we're going to have Nin Shah with us from Harvard Business School. And he's going to be talking about everyday business ethics. So please go to our website, register and come. It'll be the last seminar before the long summer break. So I hope to see you all here again so we can have a bit of a celebration as well. Great.
And I'll finish the seminar off by thanking you again, Kendy, for a really enjoyable and fascinating seminar. I have so many remaining questions, so this isn't the last time we'll talk about this, but we'll stop things now because we always stop on time. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.